Now, how do you get to talk at GibTalks? Well, a number of ways. I mean, sometimes we approach you. Most of our speakers we approach. Sometimes you send an email or get in touch or let people at Culture know that you want to speak. Or you can stop me in the street and tell me, el año que viene voy a hablar yo, which is exactly what our next speaker did. And given her prominence in the pro-choice campaign a few years ago, she's not someone who likes to hear the word no. So please welcome on stage Isobel Ellul.
I'm going to tell you a brief story about the men in my life. My grandfather, Vincent Acris, or Vicente el Peluquero, and my father, Eric Ellul, once fondly known as Petrocelli, don't know if you remember, and how they inspired me to be who I am today. They started in life from very humble beginnings. Vicente, born in Gibraltar in 1912 and living in La Línea, started working at the age of 11, selling eggs. And my dad, from La Calle Comedia, born into the Second World War, was sent to the Merchant Navy at 16, as per his father's wishes. But they both had different plans and aspirations. They became socially mobile, respected locally, and set up their own successful businesses. Vicente, with the most popular hair salon in Gibraltar at the time, and barber to the governors, and my dad with his own law firm, practicing on his own. They both had the audacity to challenge societal norms, institutions, and defied the glass ceilings of their assigned futures and roles, believing that choice of opportunities should be available to all, irrespective of life circumstances and labels. My father had married my mum and taken her to London. While they worked any jobs, including construction, that's my dad there on construction site, any jobs to pay for his legal studies. My brother and I were born and living in London from the late 1960s to early 1970s. And this was a time of social revolution, women's emancipation, hippies, the Vietnam War, Central America instability and liberation theology, and global division with the Cold War. So this actually planted a rebellious seed in me, un gusanillo. My formative years, visiting Gibraltar during school holidays, staying in Humphreys with my grandparents in a crowded flat, and then growing up with a closed frontier, really didn't suit me. I wanted to stay in London. And this had me turn to and learn from the men in my life, because women at the time were much more tied into stereotypical gender roles. So I shaped my actions, outlook on life, politics, religion, and community because of Vicente and Eric. For those of you under 40, maybe even younger, you know, as you go back in time, there were more glass ceilings and they were thicker, much thicker. Not only of gender, race, sexual orientation, ability, which people still experience today, but also class, status, your family name, and where you lived. And Gibraltar, with a closed frontier, also had a prolific judgmental grapevine. And this is well before Facebook and Speak Freely. So I rebelled against the contrast that was Gibraltar to London. As I saw it, anonymity in a dynamic and progressive London versus the world had stood still. Everybody knows you, Gibraltar, especially with the closed frontier. And this may resonate with some of you from my generation. I know that others have related to me that they enjoyed the safety and were content, as they felt they really didn't know any better. But I was annoyed at being defined as la nieta de Vicente el Peluquero, or Eric Ellul's daughter, and having to behave in an appropriate ladylike manner becoming of these men. I was a tomboy. I wanted to be a Sea Scout like my brother, not a Girl Guide doing arts and crafts. I remember this was different times. I wanted to feel free. So I became an annoying teenager. And in fact, it wasn't until 1985 that about 10% of us from our school year actually got to leave Gibraltar and go to the UK to study at university. And funnily enough, I studied sociology. So there's a bit of Richard's serendipity thrown in. Now, politics was always a contentious but vibrant debate among the men at home. Philosophical discussions between Vicente and my father were always interesting to listen to. The Cold War, Franco's regime, terrorism versus freedom fighters, Marxism, and so on. You see, my grandfather had joined the Republicanos during the Spanish Civil War, and he narrowly escaped the firing squad. And that's when he then came to live permanently in Gibraltar. So his experiences shaped his worldview. He considered himself a communist, and this is against the backdrop of the Cold War, by the way. He was anti-establishment and believed the institution of religion was about patriarchal social control, even though he was hugely proud of his Jewish heritage. He also wrote regularly in El Área newspaper. I bet you didn't know that. He was a progressive eccentric, and I love eccentric. My grandparents' generation was a tough and resilient one, though. They saw so much suffering and experienced so many hardships from the First World War, which they were born into, up until 1985, when the frontier opened fully. My father politically also liked to put his head above the parapet. He organized a demonstration with Albert Boggio in London against the closure of the frontier. And I was there in my pushchair, an activist before I knew what the word meant. And you see where I'm going with this. And later, in 1976 and 1980, he stood for election as an independent on the ticket of dialogue with Spain. Wow. A visionary or a madman? Never have I seen so many tomatoes and eggs thrown out of windows during hustings. It did not go down well. And I proudly handmade his rosettes because I admired his courage to stand up and be countered, and his resilience against opposition. He was entitled to his view, and that's democracy. Years later, also hoping to make a difference, I too flirted with politics and became a GSD MP in opposition for a term. But that's, I think, a story for another GibTalks. As a lawyer with his own practice, my dad's passion for matrimonial law saw him lobbying for reform in this area, and the start of his prolific letter writing for the newspapers. He achieved this, making divorce easier and more accessible to all. He had the support of Sir Joshua Hassan, his legal matrimonial adversary, but he also got himself into a little bit of trouble with the church. Inspired by his audacity and resilience, years later, I too, with the women in my life, Selina, where are you? We rattled the church cage by campaigning for reform on abortion law. On the ticket of choice, like my father, being a voice for the voiceless and vulnerable to choose their own futures. but always respecting others' right to hold a different view to ours, because that's how my parents taught me. But what resonated most was both Vicente and Eric's sense of social responsibility. Vicente always had a smile on his face, a kind word, or a flirtation if you were female, for those of you, if you ever remember going to his salon. And he had many stories to tell. Vicente was generous with his possessions, even when he had very little of his own. My father was always active in charity and pro bono work. And when I was argumentative as a teenager about some of his legal clients and cases that he took, two things he said to me that will always remain with me. Isobel, everybody has a story to tell, and hence GibTalks, right, Julian? And if you're ever in a position to help someone, you have a moral obligation to do so. So I followed in his footsteps, encouraged by him, helping with his charity work as a child and later doing my own, lobbying for change and choice, for increased and improved services for cancer and specifically breast cancer care, which my dad helped me with, and varied community involvement, which I embraced. In 2004, my father was awarded an MBE for services to the community of Gibraltar. We were so proud, and we also got very drunk at the Harrods Food Hall after. I followed suit 8 years later in 2012 and was awarded my own MBE. I believe at the time we were the only father and daughter in the Commonwealth with MBEs. But funnily enough, by then, the tables had turned and people would ask my dad, "Are you Isobel Ellul's father?" And we've obviously laughed about that many times. But today, I also take inspiration from two other men, my sons, Jamie and Simon, and their partners, Rosie and Jade. They are non-judgmental and have embraced inclusion, respect, and tolerance with no effort or labels. This generation has continued to be audacious and challenge for opportunities and choice for all, breaking more glass ceilings, being progressive. So we're getting there. I now proudly tell people I am Jamie and Simon Hammond's mother. But I am audacious. I am Isobel Ellul, MBE, as my friend Ricky keeps on reminding me to be proud of. And I am proud because the MBE represents my audacity, inspired by the men in my life, and the right to fight for choice, to become socially mobile, to be respected as an individual, to make these choices irrespective of life circumstances, and to have access to them. Because without choice and access, we lose the open heart of a nation, which I felt in a London of the late 60s, early 70s, and can go back and be stuck in a closed island mentality of labels, judgment, and social control, which I saw in a 1970s Gibraltar with a closed frontier. So to the generations that follow us, please continue to change the narrative and champion the audacity of choice. Smash those remaining glass ceilings for equity, for our society, and for the world. Thank you, Dad, wherever you are, and thank you, Mum. And thank you all for listening.